Hello, welcome. I hope your coffee is warm because today we are having a very cozy how to build your color video because we're doing Selesnya today. It's the colors of loving your small creatures and not caring about them, not being so very strong, because you need all of the little guys and you need all of them to grow stronger in the end so that eventually you can win because no one really saw you coming. That's what we're talking about today. What is Selesnya? Well, it is the color combination of taking care of your creatures for a go wide strategy, sort of, with a lot of synergy and not a lot of individual power. So you will need all of your creatures to stick around because all of your creatures need all of your other creatures to be strong. You want to build up value over time. It is almost like you are building your society, your perfect little natural corner of the world, and you don't really care about being the explosive deck. You don't want the flashy plays, but you want a steady power gain and you want people to underestimate your power so that eventually you do get that chance to play, to win, and have your cute creatures be all you need to beat all of those dragons and warriors. So the colors we are in are green for a little bit of ramp and of course a little bit of nature loving goodness, and white is mostly used in this color combination for protecting your little creatures and for making very small creatures that don't really do much on their own, but also about working very well with those really small creatures. But we're missing the colors of black, so we don't really have that great targeted removal outside of the ones that white's been given, well, which are really good, but you do miss that really bulk of removal. And we are missing blue for really guard raw is mostly what we're missing. Same with black, actually those colors are really giving us a lack of it. And red we are missing because we don't really have that aggressive part that you would have if you had green, white and red. So I think that really finishes this color combination for a creature focused deck. So that is a weakness from Selesnya, but you still have that really focused deck building that could make it easy to be strong in numbers. The themes in Selesnya are fourfold. So like I said, first of all, you love being strong in numbers. Community and collectivism is all we are about. We want to be together, we want to be in harmony, we want all of our friends to stick around for as long as possible. We have druids, clerics and monks to help heal our fallen warriors or maybe strengthen them when they are not strong enough to do anything on their own. We love nature is the second theme. We love the little sacred groves, we love the living sanctuaries, we love making little places where we can calm down and stay for a while, maybe for a very long while, and then join the cult. We love the slow growth of a grove that really shows us how when you take care of something, when you give something attention, it will grow. And we love having our animal companions around, and we form huge bonds with those creatures and really can't do without them. Then faith and spirituality, because Selesnya is a very spiritual color combination where there are many themes of wanting people to believe in what you believe in as well. So there's a little bit of that, which is the darker side of Selesnya. We love to enforce our divine order and we love to enforce our way of having peace with everyone, but it is forced, mind you. And we love the resemblance of a celestial guardian that watches over us and maybe like Selesnya herself. And then there's a fourth theme that you might not really expect, which is military. We are united, we work together, and we do love pacifism, but we enforce it. So we do have an army to make sure that people don't attack us and that our people are safe. So what to expect from today? So we will be going through many things that you will need to build a Selesnya deck. We will go through the commanders to choose, through some deck building tips, playstyle tips as well, some staples that you really need for any Selesnya deck. So if you are not really sure about what deck to build or what theme to go with, even after this video where we will explain that too, then you could just grab these staples and make a deck basically out of it, and make sure that you will always be able to use those cards as a basis for any Selesnya deck. We will be going through some strengths and weaknesses, what to watch out for. Any weakness is a thing that you can solve by having enough synergy in your deck. We will be going through some combos and other win cons so that you do not just fiddle around with your cards and never win. And there will be a path to upgrade your deck. If you are starting with the budget version, there will be some cards for you too, but then of course maybe later you want to upgrade it, and there will be a guide for you in that manner too. So enjoy. So in order to go through our first path, the strengths and weaknesses, we will be defining first what the purpose of Selesnya is so that we can find those strengths. So the purpose of Selesnya, which makes it different from all the other color combinations, is that you win through sheer board presence after building up your community. So with other combinations of colors, you have many ways to get through with those bunch of creatures that you will be building, and you will be wanting to use those creatures really quickly. Well, now you want to slowly build it up and protect your creatures while you are building up your board, and you will basically only win when your board is complete, when you have that full community of creatures and cuteness around to bash your opponent's heads in with peacefully. You want to fortify your position, you want to protect your creatures, and you want to look for a moment where you can win. And you really focus on synergy over just playing good cards. If you are all about synergy in a creature way, then I think Selesnya has a really great color combination for you. So obvious strengths that come through from those purposes are token generation. Now Selesnya isn't the greatest color combination for this because there are many other colors that are great with token generation. So they're not really the strongest, but they do have some of the great things you need for token generation, and they are the most well known, I think, color combination for token generation. But the Selesnyans are really good and are some of the best at giving your creatures buffs, having anthems around to strengthen those tokens. Even if you're not the best at generating a bunch of tokens, you are one of the best color combinations for buffing those tokens that you do make. And of course you have ramp because you have green and you have a strong sense of protecting your board. Now, the three most glaring weaknesses that you have are that if you do get board wiped, there aren't many ways to get back, because mostly, and this is also the second weakness, you are limited in your card draw ability if you don't have the synergy. So there are many ways to get cards when creatures enter the battlefield, for example, or stuff like that, and you will have a bunch of creatures enter the battlefield so that you can draw a bunch of cards, or maybe you're working with auras and then you need to build a deck and a board about around that. And the third weakness is that you are slow at building up and you don't really have those great finishers. You can give your creatures trample sometimes, but not often do you get the chance to give your creatures haste, except if it's from an equipment, or basically there are not many ways in other ways to do that. So you aren't really going to win randomly out of the gate. So you won't have a bunch of ways to surprise your opponents. You will get a bunch of value often from the synergy that you are building, but then you need a way to finish the game, and that will be the hard part for you. So the mindset that we really need to adopt when choosing our commander, but also while playing and deck building, is being patient. First of all, think like a gardener, where you are cultivating your board and maybe perfecting what you are building around with. Then you need to think about your position. You need to be strategical about it. You don't overcommit ever, because then you will lose all of your pieces, and you need a bunch of pieces to be good in any way. So be careful with them. And then you need to find ways as quickly as you can to leverage your board states. So even if you use every small little creature, you do need to be able to use them. Even if sometimes you do have to sacrifice them. There aren't many ways in this color combination, but there are many colorless ways to sacrifice your creatures and at least have a way to bounce back later. Also, make sure that you keep the visage of being harmless, because often as a Selesnyan player you won't draw a lot of attention, but don't try to draw attention by poking any unnecessary bears. You are peaceful, or so you want to let it seem until you have the ability to win. So now let's go over the top 11 commanders and their archetypes. So how I have done this is I have looked for the most popular commanders in the many themes that Magic sports, and I've looked for the most popular commanders in each of these themes and looked if there were any Selesnyan ones in there. The most winning one, I think, is Hamza, because he is in the very popular theme of +1 counters, and Hamza, Guardian of Arashin, is a 6 mana commander that does get cheaper. I really often don't like 6 mana commanders, but he gets cheaper, way cheaper, even if you are doing it right. And it really shows us what Selesnya is all about, because Hamza says it costs 1 mana less, colorless mana less, to cost for each creature you control with a +1 counter on it. So you want to have a bunch of creatures, you value all of your small creatures, and you want to make them stronger with +1 counters so that you can play your commander. And then the second ability is that creature spells you cast, when Hamza is out of course, cost a colorless less to cast as well for each creature you control with a +1 counter on it. So the same thing applies to all of your other creatures, making this a very strong commander for getting all of your creatures out, even the big creatures later, when you do need to have a bunch of creatures already on the battlefield. That is again your weakness in Selesnya, but it is also your strength. So really play around with that. And I love that this is a commander in Selesnya that is all about +1 counters, because of course we know the proliferate and stuff like that, that is really popular. But Hamza is doing this in a really authentic way, I think, for Selesnya. And there are a bunch of ways to make +1 counters strong, like giving them flying, or maybe giving them unblockable with Champion of Lamphold. There are many ways to make sure that you do get the win in the +1 counters archetype for Selesnya, so I think this is a great one for it. Then we have a commander that has 2 archetypes that they are very popular in, auras and hate bears. Can you already guess? I don't think so. It's Ellivere of the Wild Court from Eldraine. Auras is really what they are popular for. So Ellivere of the Wild Court is a 4 mana commander with a decent body but not much else on the creature itself, that says when it enters the battlefield or attacks, create a virtuous roll token attached to another target creature you control. Meaning that enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each enchantment you control. So they can get very big very quickly. If you just put it on one creature and it's the only enchantment on there, it's just a +1/+1. But if you already have 2, it's 2+2+2s. So you can see how this can get out of control, especially if you have a bunch of other auras around there that, are just also there. So there are many ways, of course, to break enchantments and auras, but I think you just want the very cheap ones and then make your creatures stronger, and then you will need a way to finish the game. So perhaps Trample will be a very good one. Make sure you have enough, because they aren't inherently in this archetype, definitely not in your color combination. So make sure that you just push in those Trample cards, or unblockable maybe if you can get it. Then the second way to play Ellivere of the Wild Court is hate bears. So what this means is you want a bunch of cards that are just about making sure that your opponents can't play the game. Perhaps they can't cast more than one non-creature spell each turn. Perhaps they can't activate abilities of artifacts. Perhaps they have their non-basic lands enter tapped. Stuff like that, so that they just can't play the game, and often many of your opponent's decks will be shut out of there by just one of your cards. And if you can do this to all of your opponents, you will sort of have won. But do make sure, please, that you have a way to win the game. Look at the combos later or something like that, but do have a way to win the game, because this can be a very annoying deck otherwise. Enchantress decks are basically the same as aura decks, but well, in this case you don't need auras per se, but you can also have big enchantments that just lay around on the battlefield. Sythis is a really prime example, because basically whenever you cast an enchantment, you draw a card when she is out, and it's just a 2-mana commander, so you can very easily quickly play her and make sure that you have a bunch of auras to put onto her. Perhaps to make her stronger or other creatures around her. She is the prime example, I think, of the Enchantress theme, where you just want to play a bunch of enchantments that won't win you the game again, so do make sure you have at least some ways to create perhaps flying creatures with spirits or stuff like that, or give them trample again. Before I started this video, I didn't really think that Selesnya was going to be just the enchantment color combination, but we have another commander that is just about that. Satsuki the Living Lore is very popular in the saga archetype, where of course you could play 5-color sagas, but Satsuki is just such a cool commander that she got into there as a very popular version of this archetype. So Satsuki says, if you tap her, you put a lore counter on each saga you control, so progressing all of your sagas at once. That means that if you can, well, do this with a bunch of sagas out, you will get as many effects as you have sagas on the battlefield. So really speeding up those sagas and really getting rid of that weakness of the saga that you need to have the enchantment out on the battlefield for a few times. Also, when Satsuki dies, you may either return a saga or enchantment to your hand, so you can get those first chapters again, or you can return a saga from your graveyard to your hand, which I think is better, because then you will have played all of the chapters out. But Satsuki is a really cheap commander, so 2 mana again, and you can definitely have her die 2 or 3 times in your game, so that will at least be 3 sagas, so that's something. But I think the lore counter on each saga you control is the most interesting part of her. I am glad Selesnya got this archetype, Group Hog, because it is so thematic for the color combination and its, well, philosophy. Gluntch the Bestower is a jellyfish. I think that is one way to sell this card. It's a 0/5 with flying, so they won't be able to block this 0-powered creature. But it also gets stronger, as you might have thought about the fact that, well, it has flying. At the beginning of your end step, you choose a player. They put 2+1 counters on a creature they control. And then you choose a second player to draw a card, and then a third player to create 2 treasure tokens. So, of course, you can choose yourself for one of those effects, and then you need to choose 2 other players and lock one of them out, so you will basically be making one enemy of that game. So basically what you want to do with this deck is give your opponents a bunch of stuff, make sure they like you, and then they don't expect you to win with your 2/7 flyer. Let's get a little bit closer to Selesnya herself with Trostani, who is Selesnya's voice. Trostani is really good as a populate commander. Of course, there are different ways to play her, just playing tokens or something with the life gain, but Trostani's main ability is that for 3 mana you can tap her to populate, meaning you can make a copy of a creature token that you control. So you really want to have a bunch of big tokens that you love to populate. So perhaps it's a 5/5 or something like that, and then for 3 mana you can create a 5/5, and that's basically how far you will go with the ability itself. But then you will of course have many other ways to break this. So again, you are working with synergy, and your one commander isn't the greatest thing, but working together with those synergies is the way to break such a commander. Kudo seems like just a typo commander, but really he does have 2 themes that he is popular for. Maybe even 3, but again, the +1 counter thing isn't really, well, easy to get into the most popular cards or commanders. So Kudo, of course, is a very great bear commander because other creatures have base power and toughness 2/2s and are bears in addition to their other types. So basically you could play anything and they will all be bears. So that's one way to play this. But also everything is a 2/2, so bears will be just as strong as the other guys. So if you can make sure that your bears are just a little bit stronger, then, well, you are winning. And of course, who doesn't want to just play it plain 2/2 and have it be just as good as the other creatures? The second way, and maybe the most realistic way to play Kudo, is not as a typo commander, but really about being the anthem commander. Because all creatures will have base power and toughness 2/2. If you can be the one with the most anthems, so if you can be the one to give all of your creatures as many examples of +1/+1 as you possibly can, then you will be so much stronger than your opponents. Think about it, all creatures are 2/2, so just one +1/+1 is a 50% increase and will make all of your creatures just win if your opponents don't have that anthem. So your creatures will be stronger. Isn't that a great selling point? I think my favorite Celestian anthem commander is Sovereign Okinec Ahau from Ixalan. It's a cat, so who doesn't love that? But most of all, its ability is really interesting because when he attacks, he does need to attack. For each creature you control with power greater than the creature's base power, put a number of +1 counters on that creature equal to the difference. So one way you can do this is putting +1 counters on those creatures. Of course, if you do that, then for every +1 counter on it, the power will be greater by 1. So you will get an additional +1 counter for every +1 counter, basically doubling them. But also you could use anthem effects, so every +1/+1 anthem effect will make sure that all of your creatures get an extra +1 counter every time Okinec attacks. So making sure that Okinec is stronger will also definitely be a plus, because then he will get to survive, but also his power will be increased. Then of course we had Kudo, but there are multiple typo commanders out there for Selesnya. One is for humans with Kyler, Sigardian, Emissary. I really like this one because it can be very explosive, and that is not usually a thing for Selesnya. But Kyler says whenever another human enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1 counter on him. And then other humans you control get +1/+1 for each counter on Kyler. So that means that for every human that enters, all of your other humans will get +1/+1 too. So every other human basically grows along with Kyler, so that you will have one big anthem effect. Of course, this is a prime example of a commander that does get removed very easily, so you do need ways to protect your commander and all of your small creatures, so definitely don't skimp on the protection in this deck. Then more cats, because cats are really the greatest creature type in Selesnya. Arahbo is the prime example. It is the avatar of all cats as well, and I think people are really scared of that word eminence, but this one isn't really the greatest thing about Arahbo, honestly. It is fun to be able to attack really quickly with your cats. The eminence ability makes sure that every 1/1 will be a 4/4 while it's attacking. But the most interesting thing about Arahbo is that he can double your cat's power and toughness for its power then. So if you have that 4/4 out on the battlefield, you have Arahbo and you pay 3 extra mana, you can make sure that that 4/4 will become an 8/8. You can do this for all of your cats that attack, but you can't stack this, so make sure to read that properly. I think cat as a creature type is very interesting because it really wants to be a creature type deck that just wants you to attack with one big cat, but also it seems to want to be about attacking with multiple, and you really need to balance that fact. But other than that, I think you can definitely make this into a great deck, but it won't be the strongest, so be honest about that part. For Hydras we have Polukranus Reborn and Polukranus the Engine of Ruin. Polukranus is a Hydra themselves. It's 3 mana for a 4/5. Isn't that the most green body that you have ever seen? It has reach as well, so your flyer opponents won't have a chance. And then for 6 mana and 1 Phyrexian white mana, you can transform Polukranus Reborn into the Engine of Ruin. It's Phyrexian version, where it will be a 6/6 instead of a 4/5, but that's not the only thing, luckily. It will have lifelink, and whenever it or another non-token Hydra you control dies, create a 3/3 white Phyrexian Hydra creature token with reach, and a 3/3 green and white Phyrexian Hydra creature token with lifelink. So basically splitting those effects of reach and lifelink, and then creating 3 3s, 2 of them whenever a Hydra dies. Of course you won't have a bunch of Hydras, but maybe you could, and then it will be a very strong effect. Definitely in Selesnya you will be wanting to make a bunch of Hydras, but those Hydras usually are just in green. So now you have an extra color to play around with, giving you a little bit of removal, but also recursion for your Hydras that were already so hard to remove. So I think this does add a lot to the creature type, and it makes it a bunch more fun. And then one of the newest commanders is Finneas Ace Archer, who of course works with rabbits. He is one himself, so that was pretty obvious from the get-go. It's a small commander again, just 2 mana, and Selesnya's commanders, they are really small. I get to learn that today. Finneas has the ability to, when he attacks, put a +1 counter on each other creature you control. That's a token, so you do want to work with tokens, or a rabbit, so you could also, again, work with the creature type. Then, if creatures you control have total power 10 or greater, you draw 1 card. So not the greatest effect, but I think you mostly want to focus on the fact that you get to put +1 counters on each other creature whenever Finneas attacks. So if you have ways to make that a strong part of your deck, then yes, this could be a great commander for all of your rabbits. You do need to get it out, and you do need a bunch of rabbits to make this even remotely good, but if you can get them out, and rabbits do love to proliferate, then you can definitely have a strong deck anyways. So my advice for choosing a Selesnyan commander, they aren't really the best usually, but you do get to choose your difficulty. Kindred decks are very straightforward, so they will be very easy, but they don't really have a high ceiling. They don't ever really get to be that strong, so it will be a bit harder to play around in the strongest play groups. But if you want a more casual experience, that you want it to be easy for, or beginner friendly, let's say, then you can definitely pick that kind of deck. Then there are some that are a bit harder, like Hydras are a little bit of a more a little bit harder as a Kindred deck, because they are all about getting those big creatures out and you need to learn to ramp, and I think Selesnya is great for that. Still, it is pretty easy, and the same goes for Populate, which is a bit harder but still pretty easy. But then if you want to go to the harder side, I would say pick Satsuki, Ellivere or Gluntch, because Gluntch is just group hug and that will always be a hard deck to play or at least to win with. Ellivere, I would say the aura part is really cool because you have those bunch of things to play around with, all of those auras that you are playing with, and then sagas are of course really hard to build around, but if you can get it to work, I think it's a really interesting deck that people really don't expect. Then also you need to pick how much you want to go with a simple game plan, like with Ellivere and Satsuki, or how toolbox you want to go, like you could go with Hamza, who's all about the +1 counters, Sythis and Trostani for that building your board state thing, where you can play anything with sagas or with tokens, so you can really pick what things you need aside from those +1 counters, for example, that will get you additional effects to have the answers for your opponents with. Now let's talk about how you are going to win the game. So there are many ways in Selesnya that will sort of win you the game but aren't really classic finishers. I think one that is a classic finisher is Absan Falconer. it's a card that will give all of your creatures with a +1 counter on them flying. There are many ways to give your creatures +1 counters, and even if you are just about getting that one creature really big, this will be a great card to add that +1 counter to it, give it flying, and well, win the game that way because your opponents can't block. But it's also a great way to have all of your creatures a great ability. You do need that +1 counter on them, but in this case it's really easy to get those on them because you are in a great color combination for that. I think the second card I want to talk about is Champion of Lamphold, which will make your creatures unblockable if Champion of Lamphold is big enough. And of course you will have many ways to give Anthem effects or maybe +1 counters to your Champion of Lamphold. Also, it says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, doesn't have to be bigger than Champion of Lamphold, but they will get a +1 counter on them, so that Champion of Lamphold can grow big enough to give your creatures the unblockable ability. So that will be a great finisher for you. This really isn't a classic one, but I have put it in here. Felidar Retreat is a 4 mana enchantment that can really work well with your creatures. It isn't really giving you evasion, but it does give your creatures +1/+1 and counters, and vigilance, which I think is very important because then you can keep protecting yourselves and you can say, well, I had to attack you because, well, I had vigilance anyway, so why wouldn't I? Then Kathar's Crusade, which is definitely not a classic game finisher, but it can give your creatures a bunch of +1 counters, and I think this is really what you need to give all of your creatures enough board presence so that they can all be dangerous. Usually what happens is you have 1, 2, maybe 3 creatures that are dangerous enough for your opponents to block, but they can because that is not really that hard. But now you can have a way to make all of your creatures dangerous, and well, then your opponents won't have enough creatures to block, hopefully. So I think this is sort of a finisher for Selesnya. And then Akroma's Will is a very expensive version of a finisher, but is a great one for Selesnya because it does give you that protection if you need it, giving creatures indestructible and protection from all colors and lifelink. Or it could be a finisher where all of your creatures gain flying and double strike and vigilance, so that eventually you can at least win the game in any way. But let's talk combos, because there are many of them and they will win you the game. Rosie Cotton of South Lane is in many of them in Selesnya. So for example, pairing her with Scurry Oak, another big offender of being in many combos, will get you, well, a way to win the game, because you will have infinite +1 counters on Scurry Oak and you will have infinite creature tokens, which you should be able to win with in Selesnya. So Rosie Cotton of South Lane says when she enters, create a food token. Don't really care about that. Whenever you create a token, put a +1 counter on target creature you control other than Rosie. Didn't want to put it on her anyways, because you could put it on the Scurry Oak. And that means that Scurry Oak will get a +1 counter, and that means that you will get a 1/1 token. And that means that because a creature token entered the battlefield, you will get to put another +1 counter on Scurry Oak with Rosie Cotton. So that goes infinite, you can see, and you will have a bunch of 1/1 scroll tokens and a bunch of counters on Scurry Oak, but I think you mostly care about the infinite scroll tokens, with which you can definitely get enough damage to win with. So another example is Basking Brute Scale, which really shows how little we really need for Rosie Cotton to get out of control. So 2 mana and then 3 mana, and then you will need just one way to create 1 token and you will be off to the races. So in this in this combination, you will basically have the same thing. Rosie Cotton will get to put a +1 counter on the Basking Brute Scale. For example, you could also just adapt it to get a +1 counter on it. Then whenever 1 or more +1 counters are put on it, you create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token. So in this case, you will have infinite tokens that you can sacrifice to add colorless mana with. So you will also get infinite mana, at least colorless mana. And of course you can sacrifice those tokens immediately at instant speed, so you will also get infinite death triggers, and infinite sacrifice triggers if you care about those in Selesnya. So there are many ways to do this. Herd Baloth is one that says whenever one or more +1 counts on it, create a 4/4. So now you will have bigger creatures. So in populate decks, this is really not a weird thing to put in. And of course, there are many ways to break Scurry Oak too, because it says whenever one or more +1 counts on it are put on it, create a 1/1. That will mean that you get a creature entering the battlefield. So for example, with Cathar's Crusade, a classic one, you will get to then put another +1 counter on each of your creatures. And that will be a finisher, because then all of your small scroll tokens will also get infinite +1 counters on them. Another type of combo is with Devoted Druid, which of course says put a -1 counter on it to untap it. This was meant because it is a 0/2 to enable you to, well, untap it once. But if it's not a creature, you can infinitely untap the Devoted Druid. So for example, with Swift Reconfiguration, it's just a 1 mana enchantment with flash. You will be able to make your Devoted Druid into a vehicle that won't be a creature. Well, you can crew it to make it a creature, but why would you? And then you can infinitely just untap the Devoted Druid and create infinite green mana. So definitely that is one way. Or you can stop your creatures from getting -1 counters with, for example, Vizier of Remedies, that says if one or more -1 counters would be put on a creature, that many -1 are put in it instead. So 0, meaning you can infinitely untap Devoted Druid and tap it for infinite green mana again. Another way to break Selesnya is that there are 2 ways left, so stick with me. Another way is with Emeria Shepherd and Sakura Tribe Elder. So Sakura Tribe Elder, the green part, says sacrifice it to search your library for a basic land card. And Emeria Shepherd is a 7 mana, so it's an expensive combo, but 7 mana angel that says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may return target non-land permanent from your graveyard to your hand. So in this manner, you can return the Sakura Tribe Elder to your battlefield and then sacrifice him again to get another land onto the battlefield. Now do note that this only works with basic planes, so that is one thing that you need to think about. But you have many ways to draw cards when creatures enter the battlefield, so having Sakura Tribe Elder enter 12 times will be really strong for you. And of course, well, by then you should have won the game with those extra 10 cards, and you will have 10 extra mana in that case, for example, or 12, whatever, how many planes of course you already had and still have in your deck. Other way, last way, is with Spike Feeder. So Spike Feeder is again a card that works well in any +1 counter synergy deck. So Spike Feeder has the ability, so it ends with 2 +1 counters, and then you can remove a +1 counter for free from Spike Feeder to gain 2 life. So if you have a way that triggers with gaining life to put +1 counters on your creature, or on each creature you control in the case of Archangel Thune, you will be able to put infinite +1 counters on all of your creatures and gain infinite life. So I think with infinite life you should be able to win, except of course if you get defeated by commander damage. But another thing that you will also then get is infinite +1 counters on all your other creatures. Of course you will be removing them from Spike Feeder. Another way to do this just for the infinite life is Cleric class, which says if you would gain life, you gain that much +1, so that's a way to gain more life. But also at level 2, whenever you gain life, you put a +1 counter on target creature you control. You can pick Spike Feeder, except for the last time, I guess, and then make sure that you at least have infinite life, so it should be pretty good. So before we're closing with some playstyle tips, we have a bunch of cards that go into the core of any Selesnya deck. So let's start with, I think, the most important part, the mana base. So we're not talking about every land, because of course plains and forests go into this deck, but we're mostly talking about the ones that don't go into any color combination. So for example, lands that love to have more basic lands onto the battlefield already, or them in your hand, will be good in Selesnya, because you will have a bunch of basic lands. You'll be ramping into them and stuff. So for example, Canopy Vista is really cheap because it's in a color combination that has that ramp, but it will enter tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands, and you will probably have those, so this will enter untapped more often than not. Also, cards or lands that will give you another effect will be really good. So Temple of Plenty is a land card that enters tapped, so usually it's not that great, but when it enters it lets you scry one, and because you need all the cards you can get, even if it isn't card advantage but only picking your next card, will be really important in Selesnya. Other cards that will be great are, for example, Sun Battle Grove. It's another one that cares about forests or plains being on the battlefield, but this time you need just one, so it will be a little bit more expensive in dollars, but will be a way stronger version of your first land card that I mentioned, the Canopy Vista. Gavany Township is a weird one. It gives you colorless mana, or for 4 mana you can tap it to put a +1 counter on each creature you control, which usually isn't strong, but because you will be tapping 5 lands, but could be really strong in Selesnya. So I like this one as a comfort pick for any Selesnya deck. And then Hushwood Verge, which will always give you green mana, and then could give you white mana if you control forests or plains. So this is the greatest version of wanting to have a basic land out on the battlefield, I think. So ramp is a little bit of a weird one, because I will be mentioning Cultivate, but not very long, because it can be used everywhere. But cards like Evans's Pilgrim will be one that you will be needing to think about when you are playing Selesnya. It's a mana dork, an elf that will give you white mana, so because most of them will be giving you green mana, I think if you need that creature based ramp, then Evans's Pilgrim is a great choice. Mirari's Wake, I really can't say the letter R, well now I'm really onto there, but the Wake card is a 5 mana enchantment, so definitely a dangerous one, but because you have so many enchantment decks in Selesnya, I think I needed to mention this. But also it's an anthem, so it gives your creatures +1/+1, which will always be good in this color combination specifically. And whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana of any type that land produced. And as you will have a bunch of ramp and a bunch of ways to play creatures and get you cards for that, or maybe enchantments and get you cards for that, I think this will be a very great way to storm off and play all of your deck. Enduring Vitality is one that doesn't really go everywhere, but it says creatures you control have the ability to tap to add 1 mana of any color, and because you will have a bunch of creatures, this will be strong in this color combination. And then the Great Henge, which of course is great everywhere, but it's so expensive that it isn't really necessary everywhere, but I think Selesnya really needs this one. This one says this one will be cheaper for the greatest power among creatures you control. It will add 2 mana for you, but the really important part is whenever a non-token creature, so it doesn't work with those tokens, enters the battlefield under your control, you put the +1 counter on it, so making them stronger, and drawing you a card. And drawing that card is really what's most important. And because this can be really cheap for you to play in a green deck, this will be really strong in a Selesnya deck where you will be going white as well. For removal, you will be having to go with your classic ones, so there aren't really any special ones, I would say, for Selesnya, other than of course the white ones like Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile, which are of course always good, and take any ones that you can find because you will need them. So basically for mostly token decks of course, but for any Selesnya deck this can be a great one. Hour of Reckoning. It's usually a 7 mana board wipe, so you really don't usually want to play this, but it has Convoke, so your creatures can help cast a spell by tapping them for 1 colorless mana of it, and then eventually it will only be 3 white mana to destroy all non-token creatures. So your tokens will stay around, and as they are usually the bulk of your creatures, that will be a strong effect because you will be the only one with creatures left, and this could be a finisher if you play it on such a time. I think Austere Command is a really good one, or any board wipe that lets you choose for a type of card to remove. So destroying artifacts, enchantments, where you really don't care about them, can be really good. But perhaps if you do have those enchantments and artifacts, you don't want to remove them, so the option to choose is great. But also often you will have either a bunch of creatures that are stronger than 4 mana, or you will have a bunch of small ones. And I think with Selesnya you so often just have smaller creatures than 3 mana that the option to destroy all creatures with mana value 4 or greater can mean that you will be again the only one with creatures left. Farewell is another example that lets you choose 1 or more, so you can choose all 4 of them instead of just 2, to let you destroy, or exile all artifacts or all enchantments, and exile all graveyards, which you usually don't really care about in Selesnya. And perhaps you want to keep the creatures alive, but sometimes you really don't, so that can be an option with Farewell too. And Ellivere, which is again a more expensive one, but definitely works well with Selesnya because it is an anthem with the +2/+2 for your creatures, but it's sort of a board wipe with the -2/-2 for other creatures. So again, you really want board wipes that could sometimes mean that you are the only one with creatures around because you don't have a lot of evasion. And killing all of the creatures from your opponents is a form of evasion, I would say. Then Selesnya, because it didn't get removal, will get a special segment for protection because it is really important for your decks. I would say these ones. Unbreakable Formation is a cheap option that is 3 mana to give your creatures indestructible, which is the most important part. But you could also be able to put a +1 counter on each of your creatures if you play it in the main phase. I would say really focus on the protection part because that's the most important for your deck. This is an option, but there are definitely also better ones. But I think the fact that this is really cheap does mean that you have not a lot of excuses not to play this in Selesnya, unless you can get the better versions. King Darien, the I don't know how many is a creature version. So play 3 mana again, and then you can sacrifice it to give your creatures indestructible and hexproof this time. So they also will be protected from targeted exile effects, for example. So adds a little bit there, but also the fact that this is a creature is great in Selesnya because you want a bulk of creatures in your deck. Another creature that is great is Shalai, Voice of Plenty, so is in the Selesnya colors and will give you, planeswalkers you control and other creatures you control hexproof, so definitely a great way to protect against those targeted spells. And then we get into the more expensive territory above $10 is Flawless Maneuver, which will give your creatures indestructible for 3 mana too, but could be free if you have your commander out, so definitely a great protection spell for your commander. And Heroic Intervention is a classic one, which I think is the reason why it's so popular, but it's also just strictly better because it's 2 mana to give your creatures hexproof and indestructible, so it's just better in all ways, but it is expensive, so 3 mana for an indestructible effect can be strong enough as well. Then card draw, this is usually a weakness, but there are many ways in Selesnya in which you can get card draw, but it does require you to have synergy. So for example, Kutsil Malamet Exemplar is a cheap one for just 80 cents at this moment. Says your opponents can't cast spells during your turn, which can be a very strong effect even if you don't notice it to be. And for the card draw says whenever 1 or more creatures you control, each with power greater than its base power, deals common damage to a player, draw a card. So definitely a great commander for the anthem effects too. And Kutsil definitely will go very well into any Selesnya deck that increases power in any way, which is basically all Selesnya decks, I'd say. So this will be a way to draw a bunch of cards in this deck, but again you do need those creatures out on the battlefield and you need them to attack and get in for that damage. So definitely needs you the synergy on the battlefield. Shamanic Revelation, I think, also needs the synergy because you draw a card for each creature you control with this sorcery. That does mean that you need a bunch of creatures on the battlefield, but definitely a cheap option to... If you draw 3 with this, I think you're out of the gates with a good value, and oftentimes you draw way too many, so that's fun too. Beast Whisperer, whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. So that means you will definitely draw 2 per turn, and this can definitely spiral out of control for you because you will have enough ramp to, well, play all of your creatures out. Eladamri's Skull is a more expensive one, so nears the $10 mark, but 2 mana to search your library for a creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand. That's a great way to catch any card. Definitely if you are playing around with a toolbox deck where many of your creatures can also be, for example, removal or card draw, then this will be a great way to tutor answers out onto into your hand and then onto the battlefield, of course. And Guardian Project, it's an enchantment that will draw you a card for every creature that enters the battlefield. Basically. It does say it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, so it doesn't work with all non-token creatures, you would say, but this is Commander, so it works with all. So basically draw a card whenever a creature non-token enters the battlefield under your control. Do need to say that. To finish, I have some playstyle tips to take with you on your journey to be a powerful Selesnyan mage. First of all, be careful with your creatures. Don't overextend them unless you have enough protection for them, and only if you have a game plan for them to win you the game or to gain you card advantage through dealing common damage to your opponents or through entering the battlefield. Think about your synergies and how they can gain you card advantage and removal, because those won't always be available without synergy. So definitely make sure that your deck works well together and gives you that removal that you so desperately need. Play your anthem effects last, because they will make you the threat, and if you have those anthem effects out on the battlefield and your opponents can see them coming, they won't be as dangerous because then your opponents will have time to answer them. So make sure that you only show your opponents you have those great anthem effects that will win you the game at the last possible moment, because they will be removed and then you won't have anything to do. Also, try to test the waters by attacking with mana open to bluff having some combat tricks, because oftentimes people are afraid, even if you are green-white, that you will have some tricks along your sleeve to make your creatures stronger, stuff like that. Also make sure to definitely include some of those ways in your deck, because then at least you will make your opponents a little bit scared of blocking your small creatures, and in that way you can always make them afraid of you having it. So that was it. Thank you for watching, and also please subscribe if you want to be a part of this little Selesnyan cult.